Okay.
Hi, my name is Harvey Spiro. I was born in New York City in 1951. My parents' native languages were Yiddish. They spoke Yiddish as children. That was their first language. Um, I my I come to Warsaw now. This is for the fourth time I've been in Warsaw. The fifth time I've been in Poland. The first time I came looking for basically visiting the places that my fiance's father had come from and that my father had come from. And in the last four times that I've been to Warsaw, I've been here studying Yiddish at a summer Yiddish program.
So, can you tell a bit about your parents' story
Sure.
and your family history?
Okay. My father was born in what was then Austria-Hungary, which is now in Poland, in Galicia, in a Dorf that's not a shtetl, but smaller than a shtetl, like a settlement. And it's between Ropčice and Dębica, near Tarnów. And I visited it in 1983. And it's still farms, not a single traffic light. But he was born here in a place that is now Poland. He left to come to the United States after the First World War. I believe they came to the United States in 1920 or so. My mother's family also comes from Poland, although it was not Poland at the time. It was Russia. She was born in 1915, and her family had just come from a small town about an hour north of Warsaw called Pultusk. And her brother was born in Pultusk, and she was born in the United States. What's interesting is that my children's four grandparents, only one of them is still alive now, but the four grandparents came from places that are now in Poland, all four. My father, born in Austria-Hungary, now Poland. My mother's family comes from what used to be Russia, now Poland, and my father-in-law was born in Chebnica, which was then Germany, and is now Poland. And my mother-in-law's family came from Białystok. So all four of my children's grandparents come from what is now Poland.
So, what do you know? What were the causes why they emigrated from Poland?
My father was born in 1911, so he, as a child, lived through the chaos of the First World War with armies coming in both directions. So after the war, as soon as they could, my father's mother had a sibling who was already in the United States, and in 1920 it was just the end of the period where immigration to the United States was doable from Eastern Europe. My mother's family came probably more for opportunity because they came, I'm guessing, around 1910, 1912, maybe probably right before the First World War. But life for Jews in that time in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, was also not good. My father-in-law they were a family of proud Germans, German Jews, but proud Germans, patriots. His father had gotten medals in the First World War, but they left right a few months after Kristallnacht. They lived through the Kristallnacht pogrom. My father-in-law's father was imprisoned in Buchenwald for a while, and then he was released. The story is that he showed them that he had medals from the German army. So he would, he had gotten medals from the First World War. So they released him by telling him, you need to get out of the country. You and your family get out of the country as soon as possible. As for the fourth grandparent of my children, I don't know the story. They came much earlier, probably around 1900 or 1890 something, and they came from the Bialystok area. Let's see, of the rest of my father's family, which I know the most about, there were a bunch of siblings of my grandmother. Some went to Israel early in the 30s. Some stayed here in Poland and died under the Nazis. And a few went to the United States. And in all cases, and then obviously the Zionists, the ones, any Jew who went in the 1930s to Israel was there for ideological reasons, if they came from Eastern Europe. And this was well before the war and the rise of the Nazis, so they went to Israel because they wanted to go to Israel. Whereas my father and his family, they had lived through enough chaos and wanted opportunity, wanted to get out.
And what was the occupation of your grandparents?
I wish I knew. I don't know. When my grandfather came to the United States, he became a kosher butcher. Not a shochet, but a butcher. I have no idea what his education was. I know he could read. He read Yiddish. But he wasn't a very educated man. And I don't know what he did in the town he lived in. The towns, there were relatives in nearby towns that during the First World War, they left the settlement of Niedziada, and I think they stayed in Yeslo for a while. And that was a reasonable sized town. And they are listed, there's a Yiskubuch from Yeslo, and the names can be found there. But history, what is said in Yiskubuchs is sometimes more nostalgic than hard history.
Mm-hmm. Sure. But what when you were growing up in the United States, have you been aware of the, where your at least father, how I understand, was born?
All adults in my family could speak Yiddish, so I heard Yiddish around me, and I knew my father was born somewhere else, but it was strange because on my birth certificate, it says that it asks for the birthplace of my father, and it said Austria, and that was just silly because he was nowhere near Vienna, he was nowhere near Austria, but it was Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Americans just said, that sounds like Austria. So I knew he came from somewhere in Galicia, and as a child I didn't know much about where Galicia was. When I got older, I started getting more interested in Yiddish and learning more about, and I knew both of my parents had a lot of relatives who died during the Holocaust. So my mother had a whole list of cousins that she wrote to until the middle of the war when they stopped writing. And these people just disappeared.
And you have these letters?
No, I don't. I wish I did. They were probably written in Yiddish. My mother's Yiddish was funny Yiddish because she was when she was born in the United States in 1915, so she had a full American education and a college education and could speak. She studied French, she studied German, but her native language was Yiddish. But she also spoke fluent New York English. So her Yiddish writing, the little that I've seen of it, was idiosyncratic spelling, because she never studied Yiddish in a school. She spoke it. This was the language she spoke with all of her relatives. So her written Yiddish was ungrammatical and different. Whereas my father, I guess he learned in the United States because he became a teacher in Yiddish Volksschuls in New York. So he could, in addition to his native dialect, which would have been a Galiciano dialect from Western Galicia, his spoken Yiddish could be standard Yiddish. So, and he certainly knew how to write standard Yiddish rather than just dialectical Yiddish. Then the language in our home was English, but whenever family came around, people would start speaking Yiddish. And so I started learning a little bit.
But you were attending some, Yiddish lessons or something?
My father taught my brother and me how to read Yiddish. We knew the alphabet and we could read basic Yiddish, but we were kids, we didn't want to. And we started going to a Jewish day school where we started learning Hebrew. And Yiddish just became less important. And it was only when I got after college and much older that I started renewing my interest in Yiddish, and now it's an obsession.
Mm-hmm. So why it became so important for you?
Because it's the key to history of my family. It's the language that Ashkenazi Jews spoke for hundreds of years. It's the literature, it's the culture, it's everything. Whether you want to study history or linguistics or the customs of the people, my family, all of my ancestors for several hundred years, Yiddish is the way to do it. You can't do it. There's just so much that has not been translated into English. So if you want to know about it, you have to learn Yiddish. And also this literature, there's tens of thousands of books written in Yiddish. There's good literature, there's bad literature, of course, but some of the good literature is as good as anything written, contemporary European literature in any other language, I think. Mm-hmm. Yiddish is just a fascinating language in itself, and also it's the language of my parents and grandparents.
So the Yiddish books were also present at your family?
Yes.
Home, yeah? That's
we had at least 2 shelves worth of Yiddish books, and I sometimes looked at them. When I was younger, I could read very slowly but didn't understand. When I started studying Yiddish, they became books I could read. And I've been seriously involved with Yiddish for the last 25 years. I belong to 2 different reading groups in the Washington area, where we get together and we read stories in Yiddish. I'm actually the president of a deteriorating organization called Yiddish of Greater Washington, which is the Yiddish cultural organization in Washington. It used to be much more active, but now, just because of demographics, we don't have younger people coming in. But we used to put on. We would have 1 program a month, a lecture, an entertainer come in and do a program in Yiddish. Now we maybe do 2 programs a year, but there's still There's still interest in Yiddish. And I've also, for the last 13 years, I've been coming to intensive Yiddish summer programs in 4 times in Warsaw here. When my program finishes at the end of this week, I'm flying to Paris for another 3 weeks of Yiddish. And I've done 13 of these programs so far in Tel Aviv, in Vilnius, in Brussels, in Berlin, and Paris, and here. This is what I do during the summer.
It's interesting because I wonder, in United States perspective, your parents, for them, they were just like natural language.
Right.
For you, it's also.
For me, it's difficult. It's a
like mother tongue, or
no,
no?
It's not mother tongue.
No.
But it's not just learned, because I heard it. The sounds of Yiddish I heard around me when I went to synagogue. The older people, we had people who were Holocaust survivors, or just people who had older people who had come to the United States with Yiddish as their first language. So I've always heard Yiddish. It's only in recent years that the older people were gone. That generation is mostly gone. But Yiddish has been around me for a long time.
Because this is for me interesting. Because you say this is the last generation. So what is?
What comes next?
Yeah, basically.
Oh,
yes.
well, it's fascinating because Yiddish is having a small revival. When I go to the classes in Warsaw, they're 3 weeks. Every year they attract about 60 people. Many of them are not Jewish, and they're studying Yiddish. This wasn't happening 30 years ago. The only people who studied Yiddish 30 years ago were specialists. Now there are non-Jews and Jews studying Yiddish for different reasons. Young Poles are studying Yiddish, and they're young. We're talking about people in their 20s and 30s. They're graduate students. They're Russians, Ukrainians. There's a woman I know who she's about 25 or so. She comes from a very small town of several hundred people in Western Poland. She's going for a doctorate in Jewish studies. She's not Jewish. I know many people like that, people who are studying Jewish culture, Poles who are studying Jewish culture or Yiddish language, Yiddish literature, or Yiddish linguistics, or Holocaust studies. Sometimes they have a connection to Jews. They may have discovered that their grandfather was a Jew, or their aunt, or some relative. They may have discovered. There's a young Ukrainian woman I know who's doing a doctorate in Jewish studies. She's studying Hasidic pilgrimage. Yeah. It turns out that she had a sister or a brother of her grandfather had helped hide Jews during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. People who are not Jews are discovering connection. Eastern Europeans are discovering connections to Jews, and they want to learn more. So every year during the summer, Poland has a program in Warsaw. Lithuania in Vilnius has a program, a Yiddish summer program. Tel Aviv has a program every year. New York City has a program every year. And there's one that alternates between Paris and Strasbourg and Brussels. So every year there are 600 people or so who are studying Yiddish, many of whom have just started and just developing an interest in Yiddish, and many of them are not Jewish. So in terms of learning about Yiddish, there are people coming in more so than 20, 30 years ago. In terms of the survival of the language, that's a very different story, because the only group some of these people may try to teach their children to speak Yiddish, some of these secular Yiddishists like me, but the only group in the world that has children speaking Yiddish are the Hasidim, and not all of them, just some groups of them. And for them, the literature that I love, that I read when I come to these courses, it's treif. It's not interesting because it's not religious literature. It's frivolous.
Yeah.
So in terms of the continuity of the language, these are people who have 5, 6, 8, 10 children. So Yiddish will continue as a language and will move off in their direction and will be filled with their literature and their interests. But the Yiddish that I know that was spoken in Nalevki, that Basheva Singer and Peretz and all the other secular writers, most of that will be in the realm of specialists unless it's translated. So Yiddish as a field of interest will still grow. And it will grow. I'm sorry if I'm jumping back and forth, but Yiddish will grow because people are realizing that if you study the Holocaust, you can't just study the Holocaust with knowing Russian and German and maybe French or English. If you don't know Yiddish, you can't study the Holocaust. You just can't. If you're studying Jewish life in Europe, if you're studying European literature, Yiddish literature was a fundamental part of European literature, in addition to translations of other literatures from other languages. There's thousands of titles of original novels and memoirs and short stories and plays. Yiddish literature is, before 100 years ago, there were more Yiddish speakers in the world than Dutch speakers or Norwegian speakers or Greek speakers, Bulgarian speakers. It was a substantial language, and it had you can go downstairs to this museum and look at the number of Yiddish newspapers in Poland between the two wars. You probably know better than I do how many there were, but there was, it was a culture.
Because what in fact was really striking for me, we were preparing this exhibition about March 68. So we were doing a lot of interviews with immigrants, but it's hard to say something about 68 if you will not refer what the 68 what period of, let's say, history of Polish Jews 68 in Poland has let's say damaged and finished. And that's it was really striking for me because I was talking with the people even born after the war, and they had some knowledge of Yiddish, some of them of course, but this is what is I think quite unknown phenomena that was in Poland. I mean, it's unknown in even I don't know the Polish publicity that we had. There was the Yiddish magazines, there were the Yiddish printing houses in Poland, and so on and so on. There were newspapers. What is I think quite I mean, specialists, they know about this, but this is how the culture was present here in Poland after the war, and it was so, for me it's such a for me personally, such a, let's say, vivid example of the Jewish culture was somehow alive in Poland after the war. And this is like people are telling me, that my mother was reading every week this Yiddish newspaper, and so on and so on. Yeah. But this is also like the last generation.
Right.
Again.
Right. In 1972, the first time I visited Israel, I guess I was 21 or so, I visited a first cousin of my father's and like a second cousin of my mother's. Both of them had come to Israel from Poland in probably in 1968 or so. They came in the late 1960s. And the way I communicated with them was in Yiddish, because they had not yet really learned Hebrew. They couldn't speak English, and so the best we could do was to talk in broken Yiddish, because I'm trying to think of how old they were at the time. One of them was an older woman, and her daughters. So the daughters were in their 40s. The woman was probably in her 70s, and her husband, and they spoke just Yiddish. Their children spoke also, who were in their 40s, spoke Yiddish, but also spoke some Hebrew at that point, because they had to get jobs. So even then, that, as you say, that generation who left long after the war, who left Poland long after the war, and again, my mother's cousins came from near the Warsaw area, whereas the other cousins came from Galicia, and I believe they both had gone east during the war to survive the war. Mm-hmm. They were not in camps, but they were under Stalin's jurisdiction. Yeah. But they survived. So, but
there were just the associations of Yiddish boys,
right?
in Poland. We had this is have interviewed. There is how was his name? Svart. I was talking with the son of with Leon Svart, and I don't know, David Svart or something, quite known Polish, Yiddish poet from after the war. And this is striking for me, because it was because of this. It's also because in Polish, let's say, Polish publicity, they basically think that there was just like the Holocaust and there's nobody survived, and that there is no awareness of the existence of Jewish community after the war. But that's
they were a few. I guess I don't remember how long they stayed, but there was a comedy group, Jigan and Schumacher, who I think they were from Łódź, or in Yiddish Lodz, and they were well known. They did recordings and concerts and performances of this kind of slapstick comedy, but the Yiddish is now studied. You can find a lot of these on YouTube today. For example, I've got some old cassette recordings and even some old LP recordings of this comedy duo, and they eventually came to Israel, but for the first 5 years or more after the war, they had come back to become part of the Yiddish cultural what was there of Yiddish culture in Poland right after the war. So there were things happening, but there just weren't. It wasn't the same. The audience was much smaller. The number of performers were smaller, and people were trying to decide if they could go elsewhere. They were trying to decide: do we stay here, or do we go? And then these are really the same argument, the same debates and discussions that you saw in Poland right after the First World War. The Sionisten who said, there's no place for us here, we go to Israel. The Bundists who said, we've been in Poland for 1,000 years, we belong here, we want to speak Yiddish, but we want to be part of the Polish nation. And the assimilation. So these arguments are not new. And they remain questions today for Jews, not only in Poland but in the United States and France. France is losing a lot of Jews because of fears of anti-Semitism, and a lot of them have gone to Israel. I don't know percentages, I don't know numbers, but certainly when I've been to Paris and spoken to French Jews, many of them are afraid of potential violence, and they try to decide, they think of themselves as Frenchmen, but they wonder whether they can stay. So these are all Jewish questions. They're not. It's not just Poland that has these questions.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I was talking with some daughter of the Polish Jewish immigrant of 68 that was born in Sweden. I don't know, in the 80s, and she said that she had at school they had this kind of exercise that a teacher asked them where if there will be some kind of catastrophe, disaster in Sweden where you will where you will escape, and so children they start to think, and that girl, she told me, for me there was it was not new question, just basically I was thinking about this question before. It was not a new question for me, this is but also this, it was few years ago, but I had this kind of I don't know if they were serious, but some of my Jewish friends in France, they were telling me that we will come to Poland because there is a peaceful place.
Yeah.
But I think now it's not anymore the same situation.
Well, there's a right-wing movement here in Poland. Yeah. There's a right-wing movement in the United States. It's very scary for me because it's not what I see as what the United States should be. Mm-hmm. And in both here and in Poland, there's the question of the separation of the courts and the presidency. And my president, I didn't vote for him, but my President Trump seems to think that he is king and not president, and has no respect for the different branches of government, the separation of government. So when you're a Jew, certainly in the last few centuries of history, you always have to think is, what if things get worse here? And I've met, in my Yiddish courses, I've met a number of Jews from Sweden who all came from Poland to escape the war, because Sweden was neutral during the war. But they're Polish Jews, and their Yiddish is Polish Yiddish. Yeah. And also a lot of the French Jews who were, they were the Israelite, the French Jews who had been there for 200 years, but the newer immigrants in the 40s, in the 30s before the war, and even afterwards, a lot of them are Polish Jews. Mm-hmm. So you get to hear the same Hamish, comfortable, for me, familiar Yiddish accents in France as in Sweden, because they're Polish accents.
So, but for you, when you were growing up and now, you didn't, or you did consider yourself as a Polish Jew. I mean, it's a question rather, I mean, about how what kind of meaning it has, that kind of your family history.
Growing up, I didn't, because my parents were born not in Poland. They came from two different countries that were not yet Poland. Yeah. So their experience was, my father was in the far reaches of Austria-Hungary, mm-hmm. and my mother, I knew, was near Warsaw, but they talked about Russia, because when they were there, it was the Tsarist Russia. They were the government. They were the ones who ran the country and set the standards for how Jews were treated. It was only much later that I realized that it's all now in Poland. Yeah. And in fact, my parents both spoke not a lot of Polish, but they both spoke. There were enough words that if they didn't want us to understand the Yiddish, they would speak in Polish because I wouldn't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't know a lot of Polish because it was what was because their primary language growing up was Yiddish, and then it became English.
Mm-hmm. So it's rather, I mean, because of course I'm also, it's here also in this museum, which is called the Museum of the History of the Polish Jews. It's not so, it's some kind of construct, let's be honest.
Yeah.
It's who is a Polish Jew, but maybe, so I understand that maybe it's about, ties, roots in just Central Europe. Yeah, this is more relevant.
Right.
Something like.
Well, it depends whether you're looking in the past or the future, because the governments that affected my father were the Austro-Hungarian government, not Poland, because it wasn't Poland at the time. The Russian government affected my mother's family, but now those areas are all part of Poland. So there's a connection to Poland that has grown for me over the years, because also because I've learned a lot more about the history of Poland. I've read, but I need to learn much more. I've also come to appreciate to what extent Yiddish has been affected by Polish and influenced by Polish, and not just people who know a little bit of Yiddish think that, Polish, the Polish contribution to Yiddish is vocabulary. It's just words. They're the words that are longer or have more, different sounds. They don't sound Germanic. Those are the Polish words, but mostly Polish. And some of them are Russian or Ukrainian. But it turns out when you talk to the experts, it's not just vocabulary, but it's also grammar and sentence structure. That there are similarities in the way Polish builds verbs and puts together sentences that were very influential for Yiddish. And people don't realize that. I know this is a weird grammatical detail, but I now know that in order to understand Yiddish better, I need to learn Polish, not Russian, not German, Polish, because there's just a lot of subtle but very clear influence. And now anyone who is involved in Yiddish linguistics sees this. It's not just words that were contributed to Yiddish. It's the whole way of speaking. It's very funny when you sit in a classroom learning Yiddish, and there are native Polish speakers, and they look at a sentence, and all of a sudden they realize this is how you would say it in Polish. They're different words, but it's not the way you would say it in English or in German. It's more the Polish flow of the sentences. So it's something I need to do. I need to start studying Polish in order to understand Yiddish.
So this is what I mean on these courses you discuss that kind of.
Well, I'm not at the beginning levels, but I'm in the advanced level for Yiddish. So and yes, we have this year one of our teachers is a linguist, and he especially knows about the Slavic influence and specifically the Polish influence. And every day we talk about it. The other teacher we have is a Polish woman with a doctorate in Yiddish literature. She's not Jewish. I wish I could speak half as well as she can. I wish I knew a fraction of what she knows about Yiddish literature. It's just I've studied with her probably 3 or 4 times in Poland and in Paris and in Berlin. She's not the only teacher that I've had that's a Pole with a PhD who just fell in love with Yiddish.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's usually it's the literature rather than the language, but you name a Yiddish author, they'll tell you who they were, what they wrote, when they wrote it. They really understand the literature, and it's interesting because my guess is that before the first war, well, certainly between the wars, and only now in later years, there are Poles out there who just understand that Yiddish is part of Polish culture. Jews are part of Polish culture, and this is, it's not everyone, but certainly the people that I meet in these courses, so many Poles, non-Jews who are studying Yiddish, because there's something they feel about it. It's part of European culture, but very specifically it's part of Polish culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point, that also these people, they realize that there is a Yiddish culture, just basically.
Right.
That, I mean, one thing is Yiddish itself as a language, but also as a tool of, reaching to some, cultural reservoirs, let's say.
Yeah, and certainly there was much more sharing of cultures and blending of cultures when people live together. Probably people live together in the small towns, and people live together in the cities, but those were different modes, and it also depends on what years you're talking about. But certainly among the educated people in cities, there was probably a lot of mixing of people went to the same plays, they read the same European novels and shared stories. There was an appreciation that it was Poland between the wars was polarized, but also a very multicultural country, where it was 70% of Poland was ethnic Poles before World War II, whereas now it's 95%. So now Poland is much more a culturally monolithic culture.
Without comparison. There were not only Jews, there were also like
Ukrainians, Germans.
Now it's really
Romani, Ruthenians, yeah.
Because I'm thinking about Yiddish. That's I was talking with some woman. There was a Jewish cultural club after the war, and there was some also Polish Jewish quite known poet, Nathan Tenenbaum, who immigrated to Sweden, and there was some kind of cabaret. They were here in Warsaw, and they were singing some songs also in Yiddish. And I was talking with her, and I asked her. She lives now in the United States, and I asked her, about what was that Yiddish for you, and why in Yiddish? And she said that this is like, of course, it was some idea of reconnect to the to the period before the war, before the Shoah.
Yeah.
But he also said that from the other hand. It was in her case, my mother, that her mother, she didn't want to speak in Yiddish. She didn't want to, connect or to talk at all about that kind of all reality that was before the war. She just wanted to. To just close that period of her life and don't think about this. Of course, this is quite phenomenon, but she, you know, it was that kind of that woman that was in the cabaret. She was telling me, yes, my mother, she didn't want me to connect to that.
Yeah.
She didn't give me that access. So that cabaret, they give me to access to, you know, instead of what, you know.
Instead of talking to her.
Yeah. So, you know, that's, of course, you know very well that there are, you know, how it was. Some of the, you know, survivors would be like silent, and some other would
Right.
obsessively talk about this. But
and
it's really interesting.
And this was true in the United States as well, where I didn't appreciate it until I got older. But there were people who, when I was younger, we went to synagogue every week, and there were people who were survivors, but no one ever talked about their experiences as survivors or what life was like. And there were people obviously who had lost children, spouses, entire families, but the American Jews who were there a generation or two earlier, they didn't want to hear about it. This is something that people have started talking about now, about how terrible it was that these European Jews were coming to America having survived the war and this terrible trauma, and American Jews said, what you need to do is learn English and forget about the old country. And yet, not everyone was like that, because my parents, both of whom were not involved in the Holocaust, they were already in the United States, but I always heard about relatives, cousins, and aunts who had died during the war, because for my parents, the Holocaust was very much a topic of conversation. So, you know, presumably you've heard of Art Spiegelman and Maus.
Mm-hmm.
He goes through this period of trying to get his father's history of the Holocaust, and his father's reluctant to talk about it. And this was true. A lot of the survivors of the war, that they didn't talk about it to their families, because who could understand it? Either the American-born didn't want to hear about it, or they couldn't possibly understand. They were in safe America, even if they were in the army. It was different from being a Polish Jew captured by Hitler. They're just not comparable experiences, and no one wanted to hear about that for up until, I guess, the turning point was the Eichmann trial in 65 or so, 63, 65, when all of a sudden people started talking about the Holocaust in the United States. Even the term the Holocaust was not used, and in Yiddish it was called the Chorben, and in my family it was just called the war. Everything was before the war and after the war. So the war was very much a part of my growing up, even though it was just relatives who had been directly affected by it. But for other American Jewish families, some of them, I guess, probably just, they were far enough removed from it, or maybe they had no direct relatives that they knew of. Mm-hmm. And it was, the war was terrible and everyone was affected. Now let's move on. So they weren't, it wasn't as prominent in their lives, but in my family, we always heard about the war. We heard about relatives, cousins, survivors.
Because I think it's interesting to look on that also from that point of view of the language, because this is how I understand in Poland, for example. After the war, there was the idea of it was limited under Communist Party, but there was the idea of some kind of Jewish, let's say, autonomy, of course, under the control and so on. But still, that was not possible, for example, in Soviet Union.
Right, right.
So there was Yiddish was in here as a visible sign of this. But for example, how I know how I understand in Israel after the war, it was different completely matter. So the Yiddish
it was Hebrew Yiddish politics.
So
right.
So it's I'm wondering because like the Yiddish as the this is what that I quoted that woman. The Yiddish as some kind of remnant, of the some kind of other reality of other.
Right. Yeah.
And was it how it was in United States in your case? I mean, what do you think about this?
It depended from family to family. The way I describe it for Yiddish had four. What happened to Yiddish? The reason Yiddish has mostly died had there four reasons. Hitler, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Stalin was as vicious when his crackdown on Yiddish writers. He sometimes during the war he supported Yiddish because he wanted to win favor, he thought, in America and in the United Kingdom for his when before the United States came into the war.
Mm-hmm.
So he tried to support Yiddish, and he set up this. Well, even before that, he set up this the autonomous territory of Azerbaijan. But then he cut off the funding, and he killed in it was in 1951 or so the murdered Yiddish writers, where he killed off the most prominent Yiddish writers in the Soviet Union. So Hitler killed, obviously, in the Nazis and the Germans. I generally say the Germans rather than the Nazis, but the Germans killed off the numbers of 5.6 million, whatever. Stalin suppressed Yiddish viciously. In Israel, the third reason for Yiddish's state now, the terrible battles and the unpleasant battles between Hebrew and Yiddish, where they wanted to establish a common language. And
excuse me, can I just?
Yeah, so it was Hitler, Stalin, Israel, and America, because in America, Yiddish suffered because of the success of Jews. To be a successful American, Jews had to learn English, and they did, and they learned very fast, and they got American educations, and they got rid of their links to the.
Excuse me, I will change the battery.
Right after the immigrants in America, they forgot Yiddish, and there are lots of issues, and there are nuances with this argument, but basically, you didn't see the continuity of Yiddish in America was much lower than it was in cities like Buenos Aires, Melbourne, Australia, and Montreal, Canada, both of whom, and maybe Mexico City I would include in that as well, because those, for different reasons, the Yiddishists continued, and there was a thriving Yiddish community in those countries, maybe a half a generation after the immigrants. And so you still have Yiddish cultural institutions that lasted in Montreal and Buenos Aires and in Melbourne, Australia, and in Mexico City much longer than they did in the United States, because they were in each of those places, the Jews kept a more closed community than they did in the United States. In the United States, an immigrant, once they learned English, they could move to Nebraska, change their name, and become Catholics, Protestants, or atheists, whatever. It was harder in those other countries, and so the Jews went to separate schools frequently. And South Africa is another example of that. But certainly Montreal was a Yiddish center, in Buenos Aires, Yiddish centers long after New York had started fading. So the history of Yiddish is actually as a connection to Jewishness and as a connection to the Ashkenazi world. It also, it's problematic now because, as we started off saying, the main speakers of Yiddish right now are ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Hasidim and the people who are not assimilated in their countries. And for someone like me, I don't identify with Hasidim. It's not what I'm interested in doing. I don't see my life that way. But Yiddish is that connection that I need, and yet, if I go to New York City, the largest communities of Yiddish speakers are people with whom I have very little in common. The ultra-Orthodox.
But did you have? Or do you have some contact with them, or did you try to?
The last time I was in Israel, I went to Mea Shearim, one of the largest, one of the major Hasidic communities in Jerusalem, and I walked around. I tried to listen to see who was speaking Yiddish, tried to find Yiddish books in a bookstore, and that was very hard. About a month ago, I went up to New York and I went to Williamsburg in Brooklyn, one of the areas where there are 3 or 4 different Hasidic communities, the Satmar, and there were Lubavitch, there were Belzer, there were Vishnitzer, but I think it's mainly a Satmar community. And there I heard much more Yiddish on the street. I went to a bookstore, they had an entire shelf of Yiddish books. None of them the literature that I read, but nevertheless, I was amazed to see that there were children's books in Yiddish. There were even novels in Yiddish. I bought 2 just to bring them home and take a look at them. But I have no contacts with that community. They, when I go if I go up to New York City for a Yiddish-related event, it will be a lecture on Yiddish literature from 50 years ago, or Yiddish theater or Yiddish language. It's not anything that they have an interest in. For Hasidic groups that use Yiddish, some of them use it because that's what their Rebbe spoke or speaks, because it's used as part of their learning process. They learn in Yiddish, so they have to know Yiddish. And some of them, they do it because that's what the current practice in their community is. But there are other Hasidim who don't use Yiddish, both in Israel and in the United States. And if tomorrow their Rebbe said, we're switching to Hebrew or we're switching to English, they would do it because they don't. It's not important. The language itself, the language Yiddish, is not important to them per se. It's important because it's part of their tradition, and their tradition is not Peretz and Bergelson and Halpern and Sholem Asch and Mendel Mochel Sforim. All the literature that I study is just of no interest to them because it's not about God and it's not about Rebbes. It's just not at all interesting to them. So they use Yiddish and they expand Yiddish and they expand the use of Yiddish, but they don't love Yiddish per se. Whereas the people that come to my course, the courses that I go to, these are people who love the Ashkenazi culture of Eastern Europe that was for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. It's a different direction. It's really a different group of people.
But isn't it just, now I'm thinking, because how I understand for let's say religious Jews and for the it's maybe different for Hasidic groups. It's different thing because this is what is unique in Judaism. It's Hebrew, of course,
Right.
and special status of the language,
Right.
of Hebrew language.
Some Hasidim will not use Hebrew as a day-to-day language because it's Lashon Kodesh.
Yeah.
It's the holy language, and it would be debasing the language to use it for washing dishes or at work. It would be, for them, it would be a terrible thing. But many other Haredi Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews, they use Hebrew every day. So
Yeah.
I mean I don't know that I can't tell you which groups use Hebrew, which groups use Yiddish, but I can tell you I've seen them and I've heard them different groups using different languages. So not every Chassid speaks Yiddish, and or well, it's not just Chassidim. There are also Misnagdim, the Litvish Jews who are not Chassidim,
Yeah.
but who also study in similar yeshivas. But not everyone uses Yiddish, and not everyone avoids Hebrew
Yeah.
as a daily language. So it's a mix.
Because it's yeah. Especially, I think, in Israeli context.
Right, in Israel, it's just, that's the language of the country. So
Yeah, it's when, because you are now the third time on that course
this is my fourth time here
time.
in Warsaw, and my 13th summer course.
But can you tell me because you came, what sparked you to start really
Start
go
going to the
deep in
courses?
that? There was something concrete, or it was some
No,
impulse, or
it was logistics. I had been studying for maybe 10 years before that. I had been participating in a reading group at home, or a Yiddish reading group. But at that point, I had a young family. I had children, and it just interfered with the schedule.
Yeah.
So even once every 2 weeks, to take 2 hours on a Sunday, I couldn't always do that when I had young children. And then, frankly, what happened is that I had wanted to go to Yiddish summer courses before, but when you have a family, you can't take 3 weeks away from the family.
Yeah.
And then what happened is that when I started taking the Yiddish courses in the summer, two things basically. One, my children were grown up. One was out of the house, and the other one was almost out of the house. And two, I got divorced, so I had more say in how I spend my time. So then it was just a question of negotiating with my boss at work for taking off 3 weeks to do my crazy Yiddish program. But I had wanted to go to these programs for years before it. I just couldn't. I couldn't arrange it. But my Yiddish studies, it's probably been 20 years since I was very seriously involved in Yiddish. And before that also, I was more focused on Hebrew, because both my wife and I spoke some Hebrew, and we decided that we were going to raise our children speaking Hebrew, because she didn't know Yiddish. So for a few years we spoke only Hebrew to our kids, and in order to do that well, we had to spend time improving our own Hebrew. So I was taking Hebrew courses rather than Yiddish, and I just don't have time to do both.
But you mean like you were raising your children in bilingual?
Their first language was Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
We spoke In the house, the only language we spoke to the children was in Hebrew. So until they were 3 or 4 years old, that was what they heard from us. But of course, the rest of the world, in where we lived, speaks English. So they heard both languages. But in the house, when it was just the immediate family, we spoke Hebrew. But it got to a point where our Hebrew was not good enough to keep up with them, because neither of us was a fluent speaker of Hebrew. And kids are kids. Kids don't want to speak a different language from what everyone else speaks. They know that that's not the way everyone else speaks, and they'll tell you. My son would say it the other way. And I know people who've tried raising their children in multiple languages, and they have the same problems. In fact, there's one man I know who, Jewish man, first generation child of a survivor, married a Chinese woman. They raised their daughter speaking Yiddish and Chinese. So it can be done, but it's hard.
Yeah. And what is there anything, let's say, what was there anything surprising for you? I mean, something that you discovered now when being on that.
On these intensive courses,
yeah.
I discover things every time I come. I learn how little I know and how much more I need to learn. I learn about new authors. I read things that I read years ago and I understand better today. I meet fascinating people. The people who come to these courses typically speak 3 languages or more. That's not what life is like in America. In America, people speak English. And there are immigrant groups, and sure, there are people who speak 2 languages, but that's not usual. So these are very interesting people. They're interested in linguistics. They're interested in Jewish culture. I've met people from, for example, this course. I find sometimes the demographics of these courses fascinating. This year, here in Warsaw, there are people from 14 different countries. Many are not Jewish. Many are studying Yiddish for the first time. We have in the level 4 class, which is an advanced class, we have one young Polish woman who I think is working on her bachelor's degree, but she's in level 4, so she's already learned a tremendous amount of Yiddish. We had a woman from France, a woman from Austria who was born in Israel, a young man from Germany who is Jewish, a man from Holland who teaches in Finland, a young girl, fascinating young girl, probably about 16 years old, who must speak 6 different languages and is learning 3 more. So she's a prodigy. But what the point is that the people who are studying in these Yiddish summer programs are fascinating people. But what we learn every year is different. The teachers are usually good, and it's a vast literature. I won't live long enough to do a fraction of what I would like to read in Yiddish. I would like to try some translation. I've done a little bit, but nothing publishable. But there's just so much about Yiddish that I learned, because you learn about the language, of course, and the way the structure of the language, but you also learn about the life of Jews wherever Jews have been. There are Yiddish writers who went to Australia, who went to Israel, and you can read stories in Yiddish about, we're reading one today about kibbutzniks, but it's all in Yiddish. You can learn about the beginnings of the city of Łódź. You can learn about of course, lots of things were written about the times of the Russian Revolution, the war, meaning World War II. You can learn. You learn from the fiction, from the novels, from the fiction, as well as learning from the nonfiction, because the fiction talks about everything from people who are. Book we're reading it in my reading group at home is about In Polish Wälder by Józef Opatoszu. So it's unusual because it's talking about Jews who lived in rural communities in Poland 150 years ago. So, and this is something I know nothing about, and so we're learning the vocabulary and also how the different relations between Jews and Poles in those days were in a small town. It was very, it's nothing you read in other places. It's fiction, but you still, the writers were talented writers. They did research, so you're learning interesting things about the life of Jews in Europe that you can't read anywhere else.
Yeah. Did you have you been thinking about gaining Polish citizenship? Passport?
I don't think I'm eligible. I don't know what the rules are. Although now I'm thinking, because my father left probably when Poland was reestablished after World War I, so
if it was 1920, it was
I believe it was 20. I know it was after the war, and I know it was before 21. So I should look into that. If I could, I would. I've only seen a little bit of Poland. I've seen a few cities around Warsaw. In the 1980s when I came, I saw a little bit of Wrocław and Chebnica, all in Silesia, where my ex-wife's family came from, and also a little bit of Galicia and Krakow, where my father's family came from. My father came from, but it's a big country. There's still a lot to see.
But so then it was in the 80s. It was your first trip to Poland,
right?
And so how it was?
Well, very interesting story, because it was a Jewish heritage trip. So it was there were Jewish groups that were beginning to be arranged in the United States to visit Budapest and Prague and Vienna. It was really those three cities. It was not about Poland, but we extended for a week, and we my fiance and I extended for an extra week and drove around the western and southern Poland to visit where her father was born and where my father was born. So we did that, and the interesting part, I forgot about this, the leader of the group was a young rabbi from New York, whose name is Michael Shudrich, who is now the chief rabbi of Poland. And a few years ago, when I came on one of my Yiddish programs, I ran into him here in the museum. I went up to him, introduced myself, and reminded him about the trip that he led that I was on 30 years ago. And so he said I should come to his shul on Friday night and see the service. So it was, he's a busy man and he's got many things to do, but it was just very nice to see him again, and interesting to see him leading a congregation here and living in Poland and speaking in what to me sounded like very fluent Polish.
Yeah.
So and the other curious thing is that Schuldrich was born in a town in New York where my grandfather lived.
Mm.
So when my grandfather, the last years of his life, it's a very small town in the Long Island section of New York. But I think my Rabbi Schuldrich was born there, and my grandfather ended the last years of his life there. So I mean, there are these strange connections to Poland once again.
Can you name your parents and grandparents?
My father was Yisrael Yosef ben Chaim Simcha Spiro. Spira was how it was pronounced then. My mother was Shena Gittel Bas Tzvi Hirsch Rakido. My father's father was Chaim Simcha ben Zevvolf, I think, Spira. My father's mother was Nechama Chumshe, I forget, Chumshe Schild, that was her maiden name. My mother's father was, I was named after him, and he was Tzvi Hirsch Rokido, and my mother's name was Esther Janover. And I know I have a family tree with one generation or two generations above that, and that's about all. But I know nothing about those people.
But do you have any family graves here in Poland, in your father's town?
My father's town it's a farming settlement. There's nothing there. I have not been back to Galicia, so I don't know whether there's something. There could be something in Dembitz. There could be something in Jaslo. There's nothing in Jędrzejada. There's just when I went there, I spoke to the priest there, and he said there's no Jewish cemetery there. But there would be relatives there. Whether if they died during the Holocaust, there are no graves.
Yeah.
And my mother's parents both died. Well, both sets of grandparents died in the United States, so they would have to be older, previous generations. I have no idea what cities. My grandmother, I believe, came from Brzostych, which is also in the neighborhood of Novi Sanj and Talnov and Dembitz. It's somewhere in there. It's on a map, but I don't know how many generations back she was there, because they seem to move. They seem to have relatives, and they moved because of World War I. They moved to where it was safer during the war. So I wouldn't expect to find any graves. Maybe in Jaslo. Yeah. Certainly, when I visited a few years ago, I visited Pultusk, and it was a very frustrating trip because it's a short ride from here by bus, and I went there and I was hoping, it's a pretty city, but I was hoping to see some trace of Jews, because before the war Jews were maybe 40% of the population there. And I went, there was a museum, historical museum, and I tried to talk to them a little bit. I said in broken Polish that my grandmother grew up here. They weren't interested. In the entire museum, they talked about Napoleon. They talked about the meteorite from Pultusk. They talked about I guess there's like a castle or cathedral there. Not a cathedral, like a big church there. There was not a single mention in the entire museum that Jews had ever lived there. Just no indication. So
But there is new exposition, or it's quite old, or it's quite.
the museum was. I went there probably in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be something there now, and things are changing in many cities
Yeah.
in Poland. I was thinking of going there this trip, and next trip I'll go.
So you finished your
The course?
or you have still
Friday. Friday is the last day.
Okay. Thank you very much. And do you want to add something that should be said in this interview?
Only that I've been very surprised by how my feelings towards Poland have changed in recent years from visiting and also from learning about Poland and the Jews in Poland. Years ago, my thoughts were mostly negative, that Poles were anti-Semites, and the Jews were treated terribly for pogroms and blood libels for many years. But history is always more subtle than that, and the more you read, the more you understand that there were terrible things, but there were also years of living together or living next to each other, and going to the same markets, and children probably playing in the streets together. I sense that a lot of Poles are interested in learning about the Jews who had lived here, and that's a good thing. And I need to learn about the Poles, because it has to go both ways. And as far as Yiddish is concerned, I will keep on studying it as long as I can, and there's just so much to learn. And I'm really surprised and grateful to see how many non-Jews and Poles are taking an interest in Yiddish culture and Yiddish and Jewish life in Poland in general. That's part of their background too. That's what I would say.